Snow was falling soft over Providence the night an old woman in a coat, 2 sizes too thin, pushed open the heavy oak door of Genova's, the most expensive Italian restaurant on the harbor, and let the cold pour in behind her like an unwelcome guest. She couldn't have weighed more than 100 pounds. Her gray hair was pinned with a plastic clip. Her shoes were soaked through, and around her wrist hung a cheap medical ID band, stamped with a name no one in that room would have recognized yet. She shuffled past tables of men in tailored suits and women dripping in gold, past waiters who froze mid-pour, and stopped at the polished counter where a tired young waitress named Lena Voss was counting out receipts. Then, with trembling fingers, the old woman opened her fist and let a small pile of coins spill onto the marble. Nickels, dimes, 3 crumpled pennies. "I have $3.14, she said, her voice barely louder than the piano in the corner. "Is that enough for a bowl of soup?" The whole restaurant went silent. Forks stopped. The matron started moving toward her with that polite, practiced smile that means get out before you embarrass the guests. But at the very back of the room, at a private table where no one dared sit uninvited, a man in a charcoal suit set down his glass of wine and went very, very still. His name was Wesley Renner. He was 37, and in the city of Providence there were 2 kinds of people. Those who knew exactly who he was, and those who were lucky enough not to. They called him many things, none of them to his face. He owned this restaurant. He owned the docks it sat beside. And he hadn't flinched at anything for as long as anyone could remember. But his eyes had locked onto that old woman's wrist, onto the plastic band, and the words printed across it. And something in his jaw tightened like a wire pulled too far. Because that name meant something. That name was a debt he thought he'd buried years ago. Slowly, Wesley Renner stood up. Every man at his table reached instinctively beneath his jacket. The matron stopped breathing, and the most feared man in Providence crossed his own dining room, pulled out a velvet chair with his own hands, and said to a freezing stranger with $3 in coins, "Sit, please. Whatever you want is on the house." Nobody in that room understood what they'd just witnessed. Lena Voss didn't understand it either, not then. She had no idea that the trembling old woman, the silent waitress, and the dangerous man in the charcoal suit were already tangled together by a secret none of them had spoken aloud, a promise made in blood long before any of them walked through that door. She had no idea that the next 30 days would tear her quiet, exhausting little life wide open. And she had no idea that the bowl of soup nobody thought twice about was about to become the most dangerous thing in the entire city. If you believe that how we treat the weakest people says everything about who we really are, then do me a favor, tap that like button, share this story with someone who needs to hear it tonight, and subscribe, so you never miss what happens next. Now, let's go back to that quiet restaurant, that pile of coins on the marble, and the question that stopped a room full of powerful people cold. The old woman lowered herself into the velvet chair as though she were afraid it might be snatched back at any moment, her trembling hand testing the arm of the chair, and only when nothing happened did she dare let her weight sink down. Wesley Renner sat across from her without saying a word. The entire dining room was still watching, but he had stopped caring about them from the moment he read the words on her wrist. A waiter appeared, summoned only by a slight lift of 2 of Wes's fingers. "Soup," he said. "The minestrone. And bread. Bread that's still warm. Don't bring what's in the cold basket." The waiter disappeared. The old woman folded her hands in her lap, her eyes fixed on the white tablecloth as if it were made of something fragile. "I can pay," she said softly. "I have $3.14. I counted it twice." "I know you counted it," Wes replied. When the bowl of soup was brought out, steam rose from it in thin, curling ribbons, but she didn't reach for it right away. She looked at it the way a person looks at something they have already decided they mustn't want, because wanting anything had always made her pay a price. Then the trembling spoon rose to her mouth, her eyes closed, and her shoulders lowered by about the width of a knuckle. It wasn't pleasure. It was relief. Wes had seen that exact movement in men who were certain they were about to die and then, somehow, didn't. She ate slowly, far too slowly for someone that hungry. And Wes understood why before she said a word. She was rationing this experience for herself, stretching it out. Halfway through the bowl she stopped, broke the warm loaf of bread in 2, and ate 1/2. The other half she wrapped in a paper napkin with careful, practiced folds, then tucked it into the pocket of her thin coat. She caught him looking. Red rose into cheeks as thin as paper. "Saving it," she said, almost as if apologizing. "They don't always." She cut herself off. "Habit," Wes said nothing about the bread. Something inside his chest tightened and turned cold, the exact way it always did before he made a decision that other men would later regret. He kept his face still. It had taken him a lifetime of shadows to learn how to keep his face still. Behind the counter, Lena Voss still hadn't moved. She was still holding the stack of bills she had been counting, though she had stopped counting from the moment the old woman opened her fist. Now she stood there watching the most dangerous man in Providence sit across from a stranger and order warm bread, and she couldn't make that picture fit with anything she had ever known about him. She knew enough. Anyone who worked at Genova's learned very quickly what they were allowed and not allowed to see. Don't look toward the farthest table. Don't remember any faces. Just refill the water. Keep your eyes on the floor. Then go home with your tips and your silence still intact. Lena had done that for 11 months. Ever since the hospital billing office stopped accepting her promises to pay later and accepted only the kind of money she didn't have. But now she was looking. She couldn't help it. Wes lifted his eyes from the old woman and caught Lena's gaze across the length of the room. It lasted a second, maybe less. There was nothing soft in it. His stare was flat, measuring, the stare of a man who recorded everything in a room because his life had once depended on it, and the habit had never left him. Lena felt it pass over her cheap black uniform, the tired slope of her own shoulders, the way she was gripping the stack of bills too tightly, and then it was gone, returning to the old woman. But something had been noted. Lena felt it like a draft slipping through a door left slightly open. She set the bills down. "Girl," Wes said, without raising his voice. He had never needed to raise his voice. "Bring her a cup of coffee. Anything hot will do. And cut a slice of lemon cake and put it on a plate." Lena had already started walking before she had decided to do it. That was the strange thing about a voice like his. Your body obeyed it before your mind could. She cut the cake, poured the coffee, and carried both to the farthest table on a tray that wouldn't stop shaking until she set it down. Up close, the old woman was even smaller than she had looked, frail as a bird. When she reached for the coffee cup, her wrist turned just enough for Lena to see the plastic bracelet catch the light. A name printed in small black letters. Lena didn't read it. She had trained herself not to read anything at this table. "Thank you, dear," the old woman said, and lightly patted Lena's hand once with fingers as cold as ice. Lena's throat tightened around something she couldn't name. "You're welcome, ma'am," she managed to say. She walked back to the counter and didn't look toward that table again, because she could feel Wesley Renner's attention following her the whole way. Not exactly unkind, just complete, the way a closed door feels right before it opens. When the coffee cup was half empty and a little human color had begun to return to her cheeks, Wes gently pushed the plate of lemon cake toward her and asked in a low voice, almost tender, a tenderness the men who sat at his table every day would never believe was real, "Where did you come from, ma'am?" The old woman hesitated, her fingers turning the handle of the coffee cup round and round. "Not very far," she said. "A place called Mahoney Senior Care, out on Pawtucket Street. They call it a retirement community." She said the word community, the way people speak a word in a language they don't trust. Wes didn't move, but that name had just landed on the table like a stone dropping into still water, and behind his eyes, something closed, hardened, and chilled by several more degrees. He had heard the name Mahoney before, not under decent circumstances. He kept his face from showing anything and let her go on. Edith looked down at the plate of cake as if she were deciding whether it deserved her trust. "At first, the place was all right," she said. "Clean, some of the staff were kind. Then the facility was sold, and everything changed. They changed the people. They even changed the locks." She stopped, her hands tightening around the coffee cup in search of warmth. "Last month, they told us dinner would be only one serving a day now, to cut costs. I asked why. Because I still pay in full, every month, taken straight out of my pension." Wes remained silent. "They said my pension is managed by the center now," she went on, her voice growing smaller. "For convenience. I signed a paper when I first moved in, back when I hadn't read it carefully enough. And now every time I ask for a little of my own money back, they tell me I'm confused, that I don't remember agreeing to it." She lifted her head, and for the first time, there was something in her eyes sharper than exhaustion. "I'm not confused," she said. "I remember everything. That's exactly the problem." Lena, standing behind the counter and pretending to rearrange the napkins, had stopped pretending. Wes tilted his head slightly, just a little. "Then how did you get out today?" he he asked. A smile flickered at the corner of her mouth, weary but sly. They don't let us go out alone, she said. The front door has a code. They say it's for our safety, but the lock is on the inside, and a lock that keeps people safe doesn't lock from that side. This afternoon, a food delivery truck came, and the side door was open for a few minutes. I had waited 3 days for a moment like that. I just walked. I walked until my legs couldn't go any farther, and then I saw the lights of this place. She looked around the elegant dining room, the tailored suits, the golden shimmer, and shook her head softly. I knew I didn't belong here, she said, but it was so cold, and I was hungry, and I had only $3.14 left in my pocket, the only thing they hadn't managed to take from me, because I hid it in the lining of my shoe. The sentence landed on the table and lay there, still and heavy. Wes looked at this small woman, who had hidden $3 loose in her shoe for weeks as if hiding a secret, who had waited 3 days just for the few minutes of a half-open door, and he felt something old and dangerous stir inside his chest, something he thought he had buried long ago. "They'll look for you," he said. It wasn't a question. Edith nodded, fear briefly returning to her face. "They always find us," she said. "There's a man who comes to pick up the ones who wander off. He's very polite. That's the most frightening thing about him." Wes set down the glass of wine he hadn't touched all evening. He glanced toward the front window, where snow was still falling steadily under the streetlights, then turned back to her. "What's your name?" he asked, though he thought he already knew, though the name on that plastic bracelet was still waiting for him to read it again just to be certain. "Edith Lindquist," she said, and held out her icy hand, as if this were a parlor and not a restaurant, as if she were still a lady with the right to introduce herself properly. Wes took that hand in both of his, carefully, as if holding something that could break. "Wesley Renner," he said. "And Mrs. Lindquist, no one is taking you anywhere tonight." A figure separated from the wall near the bar and came toward the table with the gait of someone used to moving in a way that made people fail to notice him. It was Otto Brandt, a 52-year-old man with neatly cut silver hair and eyes that never stopped sweeping the room. The man who had stood beside Wes longer than anyone else still alive. He bent down close to Wes's ear, his voice just loud enough for the two of them to hear. "I need to tell you something," Otto said, "and it's best that you hear all of it before you decide anything." Wes didn't take his eyes off the old woman. "Say it." "That name Mahoney," Otto said. "Carrick Mahoney. I know him. Not well, but enough. He isn't the type who runs small, scattered operations. Those nursing homes are just what shows on the surface. Behind him, he has backing." Otto paused for a beat. "Someone in the state legislature. Senator Walsh." The name landed quietly, but heavily. Wes knew Walsh, or knew of him, the kind of man who signed city contracts during the day and drank with men like Mahoney at night, the kind of man whose reputation had been polished so carefully that no inspector dared touch him. Otto went on, his voice still steady, the voice of a man who was merely presenting the facts, not begging. "That means if you get involved in the matter of some old woman, you aren't just going up against one greedy nursing home manager. You're touching an entire network with the law standing on its side. And our business, our work, needs quiet right now. It doesn't need a senator suddenly taking notice of Genova's." Wes finally turned to look at him, and there was no anger in his eyes, only something cold and already decided. "You think I don't know what I'm doing, Otto." "I think you do," Otto answered without blinking. "I just want to be sure you're choosing it with a clear head, not because of the name on her wrist." The sentence struck the exact place it was meant to strike, and both men knew it. Wes didn't answer. He didn't need to, because at that very moment, through the front window filmed with a thin layer of steam and edged with snow, a black SUV glided up and stopped along the curb, its headlights snapping off, the engine still running. It sat there like a patient animal. Lena, standing closer to the window than anyone else, saw it first, and she felt a cold current run down her spine before she understood why. The passenger side door opened. A man stepped out, in no hurry, adjusting the collar of his coat beneath the falling snow, then walked around the front of the vehicle toward the restaurant door with the easy manner of someone who believed he had the right to go anywhere he wished. He wore a clean coat, a small employee badge clipped to his chest, and a smile that had been prepared before the door even opened. Edith saw him over Wes's shoulder, and her whole body went rigid, the spoon in her hand freezing in midair, while the coffee cup in her other hand trembled lightly. making the liquid ripple and spill into the saucer. "That's him," she whispered, and her voice withdrew into something as small as a child's. "The one who comes for the people who wander off." Wes placed one hand on the tabletop, palm down, a gesture so slow and calm that anyone who didn't understand would have thought he was relaxing. Otto let out a quiet breath through his nose, a sound that was both resignation and one final warning, then straightened and stepped back half a pace, because he knew that when Wes put his hand on the table that way, all advice had come to an end. Two men sitting near the door, Wes's men, lifted their heads in question, waiting for a signal. Wes gave no signal at all. He only said, softly enough that only his table could hear, "No one touches her," and let him come in. The heavy oak door opened. The doorbell rang with a clear sound that felt strangely out of place inside the silence now covering the room, and the man with the ready-made smile stepped in, bringing with him a gust of cold air and the smell of a power that believed it would never have to raise its voice. The man stopped in the middle of the dining room, swept his eyes once across the tailored suits and candlelight, then locked his gaze on the old woman at the farthest table, and his smile stretched a little wider, as if he had just found a misplaced object. "There you are, Mrs. Lindqvist," he said, his warm voice polished until it was slick. "Everyone at the center has been so worried about you. You can't just walk away like that. Not in weather this cold. You could fall. You could get lost. I'm only here to take you home." He took 2 more steps toward the table, and that was when Wes stood. He didn't stand quickly. He rose the way a wall rises, slowly, calmly, irreversibly, and with one step he placed himself between the man and the old woman, not touching him, not needing to touch him. "She's having dinner," Wes said. The man stopped short. The smile was still there, but his eyes had begun to work, measuring the charcoal suit, the absolute stillness of the man in front of him, the 2 men sitting near the door who had quietly turned their chairs around. "I understand," he said, still trying to keep his voice friendly. "But she is our resident. She has memory issues, and we have a legal responsibility to look after her. If you keep her here, that really won't be good for her at all, sir." Wes looked at him for a long time, long enough that the man's smile began to tighten at both corners of his mouth. He asked for his name. The man blinked. "Excuse me." "Your name?" Wes repeated, still in that level voice, the kind of voice more frightening than a shout. The man glanced toward the door, toward the black SUV still running outside, as if searching for something to stand behind him, then said, "Deacons. I work for Mahoney Senior Care. And I don't think you understand what you're interfering with, sir." Wes tilted his head very slightly. "Do you know whose place this is?" he asked. Deacons did not answer. "This is my restaurant," Wes said, his voice still not rising by even 1 degree. "I also know this street, and the harbor at the end of it. My name is Renner, and you can go back and tell the people who sent you that tonight. They sent the wrong man to the wrong place." Something changed on Deacons's face, a slow, cold recognition spreading from his eyes down to his mouth, and the smile he had brought with him finally collapsed. That name meant something to him, exactly as it meant something to anyone in Providence sober enough to listen. And Wes saw the moment he understood where he was standing, and near whom. Deacons swallowed dryly. "I'm only following orders," he said, and for the first time his voice revealed a thin crack. "Mr. Mahoney will want to know about this. Then let him come ask me himself," Wes replied. "As for you, you're going to leave my restaurant, get into that car sitting out there with the engine running, and you won't put your hands on this woman. Not tonight, and not on any other night." The silence in the room grew so thick that people could almost hear the snow touching the window glass. Deacons looked at the old woman one last time, then at the 2 men near the door, then at Otto standing motionless with his hands hanging too loosely, too calmly at his sides, and he calculated, the way every man who makes a living frightening the weak always calculates when he suddenly finds himself facing something stronger. He stepped back. "This is a mistake," he said softly, but the words sounded hollow, the words of a man retreating while trying to salvage a little pride. Wes didn't bother to answer. Deacons turned, walked past the silent tables, and pushed the oak door open into the snow. And a moment later the black SUV slid away from the curb, its headlights flaring to sweep a blade of light across the window, before vanishing into the dark. Edith was still sitting very still, both hands clenched in her lap, and when Wes turned back to the table, she looked up at him with eyes shining with something caught between gratitude and terror. "They'll come back," she whispered. Wes sat down across from her and signaled for one of the two men near the door to come stand beside the table, a quiet, solid shadow. "I know," he said, "and when they come back, you won't be alone anymore." Less than 40 minutes later, after Edith had been served, another cup of hot tea, and Wes's man was still standing silently beside the table like a shadow. The oak door opened again. This time, no SUV had glided up beforehand, no engine was waiting at the curb, only one man walking in alone, and at once the whole room felt that this one was nothing like the man who had just left. He was around 44 years old, wearing a dark suit, so finely tailored it was nearly on the same level as Wes's. His neatly combed hair touched with gray at the temples, and he carried himself with the ease of a man used to entering expensive rooms and being welcomed there. He stopped, removed his leather gloves slowly, finger by finger, then looked around the restaurant with genuine appreciation. "Beautiful," he said to no one in particular. "I've always heard people praise Genova's. Now I understand why." He moved toward the farthest table, and Wes rose to meet him, the two men standing about an arm's length apart, neither one offering his hand first. "Mr. Renner," he said, his smile calm and perfectly warm. "Carrick Mahoney. I thought we should speak directly, instead of letting employees carry messages back and forth. Things like that are so easily misunderstood." Wes invited him to sit with a tilt of his chin, and Mahoney sat down with the comfort of a man who had never been denied anything, placing his folded gloves neatly on the table. He glanced toward Edith, and his smile softened into something that looked exactly like concern. "Edith, you worried us to death," he said gently. "You know you shouldn't go outside on your own like that." The old woman did not answer. She only tightened both hands around her teacup and looked down at the table, and that shrinking silence of hers said more than any words could have. Mahoney turned back to Wes, clasping his hands on the table like a man preparing to explain an unfortunate but simple matter. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding here," he said. "Mrs. Lindqvist is our resident, and more than that, our center holds legal guardianship over her, properly approved by the district court. She has cognitive decline, Mr. Renner. She doesn't always remember where she is or what she has agreed to. I'm sure she's told you all sorts of things tonight. Stories about having her money withheld, about being locked in, about being starved." He let out a soft sigh, a sigh calculated to perfection. Those are the kinds of things people often say when memory begins to leave them. It's very sad. But sadness doesn't make those things true. Wes listened without letting a single thing show on his face, and when Mahoney finished speaking, he asked only one question. "Then those guardianship papers, who signed off on her cognitive condition?" Mahoney's smile did not falter, but there was a very brief pause before he answered. "A doctor our center works with. Everything followed proper procedure, I assure you. I can have someone send a copy here if you'd like." "I would," Wes said. Meanwhile, behind the counter, Lena stood frozen, because the name Mahoney Senior Care had just fitted itself into a piece of memory she had been trying to forget for months. The mother of Donna Pruitt, the friend who had gone to nursing school with her years ago, had also entered a facility bearing that very name in the fall, healthy, still lucid, still sending handwritten birthday cards, and then suddenly no one could reach her anymore. When Donna finally went there, they told her that her mother had been moved for medical reasons, and afterward came a phone call saying she had passed away in her sleep, so quickly that Donna hadn't even had time to see her one last time. Lena remembered Donna crying over the phone. She remembered her own helplessness, the hollow feeling of not knowing what to say, and now, standing here, watching this polished man smile across a dinner table at a trembling old woman, she felt a chill pour down her spine, because for the first time, she understood that Donna's mother's death might never have been an accident at all. Mahoney stood, fastening the button of his coat, still wearing that flawless smile. "I'll allow her to stay here tonight, because I'm a reasonable man," he said. "But tomorrow, everything must return to its proper order, Mr. Renner. The law is on my side, and I sincerely advise you, don't turn a small misunderstanding into a large problem for both of us." After Mahoney left, Wes remained seated for a long time at the farthest table, his finger tapping a slow rhythm against the wood, and when he finally spoke, it was to Otto, his voice low and decisive. "I want to know everything about him," he said. "Mahoney Senior Care. How many facilities he owns, where the money flows, which court issued those guardianship papers, who the doctor was who signed off on her condition. And I want to know about Walsh, how deeply he's involved. Otto nodded, committing every word to memory. Be careful, he said softly. People digging into Mahoney's affairs will make noise. Then dig quietly, Wes replied. He took Edith up to one of the rooms above the restaurant, a safe and warm place, with one of his men standing guard outside in the hallway, and the old woman took his hand before the door closed, her fingers still cold, though her eyes looked a little less frightened. When Wes came back downstairs, the restaurant was almost empty, with only the cleaning staff left, and Lena was stacking chairs on the tables in her section, her movements exhausted but precise, like someone used to working until the very last of her strength was gone. He watched her for a while before approaching. You saw more than you should have tonight, he said, and Lena's hand stopped halfway through the motion as she turned to look at him with the wary expression of someone unaccustomed to being noticed by a man like him. I didn't see anything, she answered, the exact reply this job had taught her to give. The corner of Wes's mouth lifted for an instant, not quite a smile. You lie fairly well, he said. But you recognize the name Mahoney. I saw it on your face. Lena stayed silent, and in that moment, something inside her wanted to speak. Wanted to tell him about Donna's mother, about the phone call, about the suspicion that had risen in her tonight, but she had learned that telling stories to powerful men was never free. A friend of mine, she said at last. Her mother used to be in that place. She's dead now. Wes nodded slowly, storing that fragment of information in the place where he stored everything, and then he did something she hadn't expected. He asked about her. Otto had told him a few things while they waited for Mahoney, and now Wes looked at her with that familiar measuring gaze. You've worked here for 11 months, he said, and you've never taken a shift off. I pay enough that people shouldn't have to do that. Lena went rigid. I need the money, she said shortly, hoping the answer would be enough to close the subject. But Wes was not the kind of man who was easily closed out. Hospital bills, he said, not a question. And Lena felt her face grow hot with the feeling of being seen straight through, a feeling she hated with every part of herself. My father's, she replied, her voice pulled tight. He was sick for a long time before he died. Insurance didn't cover everything, so we had to take out a high-interest loan to pay the hospital. After he passed, my mother spent years barely scraping by to pay it down, but when she fell ill recently, the remaining debt was sold to a ruthless collector and began compounding out of control. She stopped, then added in a hard voice, But that's my business. Wes tilted his head. Is there a name attached to that debt? He asked. Lena knew what he was asking, and she knew the kind of person that name represented. And she knew Wesley Renner was the sort of man who could make debts and people like that simply disappear, and because she knew all of those things, she shook her head. I don't need your help, she said. Wes looked at her for a moment, a flicker of genuine surprise passing through his eyes, because very few people refused something he hadn't even had the chance to offer. Most people beg me for help, he said. Then I'm not most people, Lena replied. I'll pay my own debt, my own way, and I won't owe you anything. Because I saw tonight what owing someone can turn a person into. She glanced toward the stairs, toward the room where the old woman was, and they both understood the true cost of that bowl of soup. Wes didn't argue. He only looked at her for one more second, then gave a single nod, as if he had just noted something about her that he did not intend to forget any time soon. It was well past midnight when Lena locked the back door of the restaurant and stepped into the alley leading toward the bus stop, her breath spilling white into the freezing air, and she had made it about half a block when a car parked close to the curb began creeping after her at a slow, deliberate pace that made her heart clench. The window rolled down, and a face she knew too well from her nightmares leaned out. Sal Drummond, the man who had bought her father's debt from somewhere and turned it into a noose around her neck for nearly a year now. Lena Voss, he called, drawing out her name as if he were savoring it. You're working late, aren't you? I was starting to think maybe you were hiding from me. Lena didn't stop walking and didn't look at him, because she had learned that stopping and looking gave him exactly what he wanted. I'll pay you on Friday, she said, keeping her voice even, like I already told you. The car crawled alongside her. Friday, he repeated with false boredom. You know you said Friday last week, too. Interest doesn't care about days of the week, sweetheart. It just keeps growing while you sleep. He drove a few yards ahead and pulled in to block the path directly in front of her. And this time, 2 men got out from the back seat, unhurried, cutting off her way forward, and Lena stopped, feeling fear rise through her cold and sharp, but still lifting her chin, because she was too tired of being made to feel small. "I don't have any money on me," she said flatly. "Standing here threatening me won't make the money appear." Drummond got out of the car and came around the hood, a thin smile on his lips. "I'm not threatening you," he said softly. "I'm only reminding you that things can get a lot worse." And then his voice sank into something that made her skin prickle. "And for a pretty girl walking alone this late at night, there are a whole lot of ways for things to get worse." He had just finished speaking when another car appeared at the mouth of the alley, silent, its headlights off, and stopped a few yards away. And from inside stepped two men Lena recognized at once. One of them, the quiet shadow who had stood guard beside Edith's table all evening. They didn't draw guns. They didn't raise their voices. They only stood there, and one of them said in a voice so calm it was chilling, "Drummond, you're standing too close to someone Mr. Renner cares about." That name landed in the alley like a door slamming shut. Drummond spun around, his smile vanishing, and Lena saw that same cold recognition spread across his face exactly as it had spread across Deakins' face in the restaurant a few hours earlier. "Renner," he repeated, as if hoping he had heard wrong. Wes's man did not repeat himself. They simply stood and waited. And Drummond, the man who made a living squeezing the weak, the man who had made Lena's life miserable for almost a year, suddenly looked as if he wanted to shrink back into his own coat. "There's been some kind of misunderstanding," he muttered, signaling for his two men to get back into the car. "I didn't know she was one of yours." "She isn't anyone's," Wes's man replied. "But tonight, I'm taking her all the way home. And if I were you, I'd be very, very patient about that debt." Drummond didn't argue. He got into the car and drove away, the red taillights sinking into the snow, and the alley suddenly went so quiet that Lena could hear her heartbeat pounding in her ears. She stood there trembling, partly from the cold, partly from what had just happened. And when Wes's man politely opened the car door and invited her in, she realized she was caught between two feelings tearing against each other. A deep gratitude, because for the first time in months, someone had stood between her and fear, and an even deeper panic, because she understood that this safety had a price, that she had just taken another step into a world where once people entered, they never truly got out again, and that Wesley Renner now knew where she lived. 3 days later, Otto spread everything he had dug up across the desk in the office above the restaurant, and the more he spoke, the more brooding his face became. "Mahoney is ahead of us," he said. "Yesterday, I sent someone to the county to get a copy of Mrs. Lindquist's guardianship file, and the file had already been sealed early that morning, before our man even got there. I had someone approach the doctor who signed off on the evaluation, and he had taken sudden leave and left the city the night before. Every door I meant to open had already been locked before I could lay a hand on it." Wes sat still, turning his heavy ring slowly around his finger, his eyes distant in that particular way they became when he was fitting broken pieces together. "Just a coincidence?" he asked, though his own voice said he didn't believe that. Otto shook his head. "Once is coincidence. 3 times means someone gave warning. Mahoney knew where we were going to look before we got there." The room sank into silence, and it was the heaviest kind of silence there was. The silence of two men realizing at the same time that the danger was not outside the door, but might already be sitting inside their own house. "How many people knew I had Mahoney investigated?" Wes asked, his voice dropping low and flat in a dangerous way. Otto thought for a moment. "Not many," he answered. "Me, you, the 2 men I sent to the county, and the people sitting downstairs the night the old woman came in, though they only saw things. They couldn't hear what we discussed." Wes rose and walked to the window, looking down at the snow-covered cobblestone street below, his hands clasped behind his back. He had built this organization for more than a decade on one single principle: that loyalty was a more valuable asset than money, that a man who chose the wrong person to trust wouldn't live long enough to regret it, and now that very principle was staring back at him like a crack in a pane of glass. "One of them is talking to Mahoney," he said. "Not a question. Or talking to someone who works for Mahoney without knowing who he's really speaking to," Otto added carefully. "Sometimes a leak isn't betrayal. Sometimes it's just a loose mouth in the wrong place." Wes slowly shook his head. "No," he said. "This is deliberate. The way they sealed the file, the way they moved the doctor. It was all too timely, too precise. Someone is being paid." He turned back, and in his eyes was something that made even Otto, the man who had stood beside him from the very beginning, feel a small shiver pass through him. In the days that followed, a subtle change spread through the organization. No one named it, but everyone felt it. Wes began dividing information into smaller pieces, telling one thing to one man and something else to another, planting false bits of news in different channels, the way someone scatters flour across a floor to see where the thief's footprints appear. Men who had once laughed and spoken easily with one another now glanced at each other with caution. And among all the faces around him, there was one man on whom Wes's eyes lingered a fraction longer whenever they passed over him. Not because of evidence, but because of instinct. Royce Tillman, a lower-ranking capo in his early 30s, a man who had joined later than the others and risen faster than seemed natural. A man who in recent weeks had more than once made bitter remarks about the boss wasting time and resources on a senile old woman and a waitress girl, as if compassion were a sign of weakness that needed to be corrected. Wes said nothing to anyone about Royce. He only watched and waited and carefully let one piece of information fall into the man's ear, a small and specific detail that no one else was allowed to hear, a thin trap strung in the dark, and then he waited to see whether Mahoney would once again move one step ahead of him in the exact place only one person knew about. Otto watched him do it and said nothing, because he understood that some wounds inside an organization couldn't be healed with words. They could only be healed by letting the traitor step into the light on his own, and both men knew that when that happened, there would be no way back for anyone. It was while Otto was compiling the backgrounds of the people Wes wanted reviewed, including Lena as a matter of routine because she had been pulled in too deeply, that he stopped at one name and sat very still in front of the screen for a long time. Then he knocked on Wes's office door with a thin stack of papers in his hand and an expression Wes had never seen on him before. "There's something here," Otto said, laying the paper on the desk. "The waitress. Her last name is Voss, Lena Voss. Her father's name was Felix Voss." That name landed on the surface of the desk, and the whole room seemed to tilt by some small angle. Wes didn't move, but Otto clearly saw something happen on his face, a stillness even deeper than his usual stillness, the kind of immobility of a man who had just felt a hand from the past touch the back of his neck. "Felix Voss," Wes repeated, very softly, as if saying the name too loudly would make it real. He picked up the paper and read it, though his eyes weren't truly looking at the lines, because they were looking somewhere else, somewhere 13 years ago. 13 years earlier, he had been only 24, still a sharp, reckless young man climbing his way up inside an organization that did not forgive mistakes, and Felix Voss was the man a few years older than him who had been assigned to guide him, to teach him how to read a room, to teach him when to stay silent and when to act, to teach him that a man was nothing if his word carried no weight. Felix had a loud laugh and a steady hand, and a strange belief that even in this dark line of work, a person could still keep something decent inside. And Wes had loved Felix in the way a fatherless young man loves the first man who ever truly believes in him. Then came the night at the harbor, a meeting that should have gone smoothly, turning into a trap. Shadows rising from between the crates, gunfire tearing through the dark, and Wes remembered standing exposed in the line of fire, young and slow and about to die. Then he remembered Felix rushing in without a second of hesitation, shoving him down behind a concrete barrier, and he remembered that sound. The sound that his entire life in this business still had never taught him to get used to. The sound of a bullet finding the man it was never meant for. Wes set the paper down. His hand was steady, but something behind his ribs was not. "Did you know he had a child?" Otto asked quietly, though he had already guessed the answer from Wes's silence. "A daughter," Wes said. "Felix told me. Back then she was around 15. I never met her, because Felix kept his family completely separate from the work. And that was the wisest thing he ever did." He stood, walked to the window, and this time he did not see the snow-covered street below. He saw a promise he had spoken at a hospital bedside, Felix's hand growing cold in his, and heard his own voice swearing that he would find Felix's wife and daughter, that he would take care of them, that he would make sure they never lacked for anything. And he had tried. For months, he had tried. But the wife, terrified of the world that had killed her husband, had taken the child and vanished. Changed addresses, perhaps changed her name too, severed every thread, and even a 24-year-old man with resources could not find a woman determined not to be found. Then the years passed, and the organization grew, and that promise sank to the bottom with all the things he did not allow himself to think about. "It could just be the same last name," Otto said, not believing his own words. Wes shook his head, his eyes still fixed on the curtain of snow. "She's exactly the right age," he said. Her father died after a long illness and left behind debts. Felix struggled in the hospital for almost a year after that night, fighting the severe complications from the wound before it finally took him. He turned back to look at Otto, and in his eyes was an old pain mixed with something almost like horror. "For 11 months, he said. "Felix's daughter has been carrying trays and cleaning tables under my roof, carrying the debt that buried her father, being strangled in the street by some loan shark, and I didn't even know her name." He was silent for a long time. "I need to be sure," he said at last. "Before I say anything to her, I need to be absolutely sure." The certainty Wes was looking for came from the place he least expected, from the old woman herself in the room upstairs. That evening, he brought Edith a bowl of soup and sat down beside her. And as they talked, he mentioned Lena, the waitress who had been kind to her on that first night, and Edith's face suddenly lit with a soft, nostalgic glow that made Wes go still. "Lena is a good girl," she said, patting his hand. "She's always been good like that, even when she was tiny." Wes sat very still. "You know her?" he asked, his voice careful, like someone stepping across thin ice. Edith nodded, her eyes looking into some faraway place in the past. "I used to live next door to her and her mother in Cranston, after her father died," she said. "Poor Marion, the girl's mother. She was afraid of her own shadow, always moving from place to place, even changing both their last names so no one could find them. I never understood who she was running from. I only knew she was terribly frightened. I used to watch Lena in the afternoons when Marion had to work a shift. The girl was just a young teenager then, skinny, always hungry, but she never accepted food until I lied and told her I'd cooked too much." She gave a faint smile. Her pride was like that, even back then. Wes felt the whole world tilt slightly for the second time in 2 days. "Then you came to Genova's that night," he said slowly, "not by accident." Edith looked up, her old eyes suddenly, astonishingly clear. "Marion passed away not long ago," she said softly. "In her final days, she sent me a letter, telling me Lena had grown up and was working at a fine Italian restaurant down by the harbor to pay off debt, a secret she discovered from an old acquaintance. She was so proud of her, and worried about her too. When I ran away from Mahoney's place that night, I wasn't just wandering. I remembered the name of the restaurant. I thought, if I could find the girl, maybe she would help me, or at least I could see her once before they found me. I didn't know if she was still there, so I didn't dare ask for her directly. I only asked for a bowl of soup, because I really was hungry, and because I was afraid that if I said who I was, I'd bring trouble down on the girl." She lowered her head. "Then you appeared, and everything became this." Wes sat there for a long while without being able to speak, because every piece had finally locked into place with a cruel precision almost too painful to bear. The starving old woman who had spilled $3 small onto the counter that night was not some random stranger drifting into his life. She was the woman who had once fed Felix Voss's daughter when the child was small and hungry, and the waitress who had carried that bowl of soup out to her was that very child, grown up now, carrying on her shoulders the debt that had buried the father she never knew had died, saving Wes's life. 3 people, bound together by a promise made in blood 13 years ago, had all been brought into the same room on a snowy night without any of them understanding why. Wes stood, walked to the window, and for the first time in many years, he felt his eyes burn. Not because of regret, he knew regret too well, but because of something close to the terror of fate, because of the truth that he had broken his promise to Felix for 13 years, while Felix's daughter had suffered quietly within his reach, and that it had taken a hungry old woman with $3 hidden in her shoe to bring her back to him. "Does the girl know?" Edith asked gently, as if reading his thoughts. "About what kind of man her father was?" Wes shook his head. "Marion never told her," the old woman said, almost to herself. "She wanted her daughter to grow up without carrying that darkness. I think she was right to do it." Wes turned back, his face calm again, but his eyes were entirely different, something in them hardening into resolve. "I failed to keep my word to her father," he said softly. "I won't break that promise a second time. Not to Felix, not to her, and this time, Mrs. Lindquist, I'll do it right, even if I have to burn Mahoney and everything he hides behind to the ground." Mahoney didn't send any more men with ready-made smiles, because he'd realized that force was Wes's territory. So he moved the fight to a place where Wes couldn't use his fists, paperwork, official seals, and the law. It began on a Tuesday morning, when 2 city health inspectors showed up at Genova's with a stack of anonymous complaints, moving through the kitchen and carefully writing down every crack in the tile floor, every uneven temperature reading in the refrigerator, and leaving behind a list of violations so long that the kitchen had to shut down for 2 days to fix them. 2 days, Wes knew perfectly well, had nothing to do with food safety. The next day, a liquor license inspector came asking about documents the restaurant had kept valid for years, and then came a notice from the municipal office about reviewing the restaurant's right to use the parking area behind the building. Each blow was small, each one legal on paper, each one something that could be undone with time and money. But together, they sent a clear message that Mahoney had hands reaching deep into the machinery of the city, and he was willing to use them. Otto placed the name of the man behind it on the table without any surprise. "Senator Walsh," he said. "Every one of these inspections came out of departments where Walsh's people had influence. He doesn't show his face himself, he never does, but his fingerprints are everywhere. And there's one more thing," Otto added, his voice dropping lower. "There's a police inspector named Miller asking questions around this neighborhood about you, about the night Mrs. Lindquist came here. He's building a story that you're keeping an old woman with cognitive decline against the wishes of her legal guardian. He's calling it unlawful confinement." Wes sat and listened, his face unchanged, but inside, he was recalculating the entire board. "Miller," he said. "Mahoney's man, all the way inside the police department." Otto nodded. "Mahoney buys people at every level. That's how he's lasted this long, without anyone being able to touch him." And the heaviest blow fell at the end of that week, when a district court order was delivered directly to Genova's, ordering Wesley Renner to return Mrs. Edith Lindquist to her legal guardian, Mahoney Senior Care, within 72 hours, along with a warning that continuing to keep her there would lead to criminal charges. The order bore the signature of the very judge who'd approved the original guardianship, and Wes looked at that name for a long time, understanding that Mahoney had wisely built an almost perfect legal trap, a trap in which every effort Wes made to protect Edith could be twisted into evidence against him. "This is where it gets dangerous," Otto said softly. "As long as, on paper, he's her legal guardian, and we're only the ones sheltering her, the law is on his side, not ours. You fight him with your fists and you lose, because you're standing in the wrong position. You keep the old woman here, and you become the criminal. You hand her over and—" Otto stopped there, because he didn't need to finish, and they both knew what giving Edith back to Mahoney meant. Lena, who now knew part of the story and had grown more and more attached to the old woman, went pale when she heard about the court order. "They can't just send her back there," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "She'll die there, like Donna's mother, like all the others." Wes looked at her, and for the first time, he let her see some of the weight he was carrying. "They have the law," he said. "On paper, they've done everything right. That's exactly what makes men like Mahoney more dangerous than any gunman. They don't break the law. They own it." He stood and walked to the window, the habit now a reflex every time he needed to think. "Then what do we do?" Lena asked. Wes looked down at the street for a long while before answering. "We don't beat him by breaking his law," he said slowly. "We beat him by finding the real law, the kind even Walsh can't buy, and then dropping it on his head. But to do that," he turned back to look at the old woman sitting quietly in the corner of the room, "we need Mrs. Lindquist to give us something she still hasn't fully told us." Wes pulled out a chair and sat down across from the old woman. Lena sat beside her and took her hand, and he asked in a gentle voice that did not look away from the truth, "Mrs. Lindquist, why is Mahoney so afraid of one elderly woman that he'd bring in a senator and the courts just to take you back? People don't spend that much effort on a runaway resident. You're holding something that belongs to him." Edith was silent for a long time, her 2 hands trembling in Lena's. Then she lifted her head, and this time there was no vague confusion in her eyes, no haze she had worn like a layer of clothing, only a cold, sharp clarity that made both Wes and Lena give a faint shiver. "I let you believe I was confused," she said slowly. "I let all of them believe it too. That's why I'm still alive. A senile old woman is harmless. People don't bother guarding the mouth of an old woman no one believes. But I remember everything. I've always remembered everything." She pulled her hand free from Lena's, lifted it to her collar, and with trembling fingers, she opened the padded shoulder, lining inside her thin coat. The coat no one had thought to search all these days, and from inside it she drew out a small notebook with a worn cloth cover, thin and packed with tiny lines of handwriting. "I used to be a secretary," she said. "I spent my whole life keeping records. When that place began to change, when people began to disappear, I wrote things down." She opened the notebook on the table, and Wes leaned over to look, and what he saw made even him, a man who thought he'd seen every form of human cruelty, fall silent. Every page was filled with names, dozens of names, each one paired with a date, a number, and one short note. "Margaret Ellison," she read softly, her finger moving over the lines. "Admitted in March, clear-minded, owned a house in Barrington and had savings. Signed, financial power of attorney in May. Died in July, in her sleep." That's what they said. The house was sold 2 months later. No funeral. No family notified. She turned to another page. Harold Bishop. Admitted still healthy. Still able to walk on his own. 3 months later, gone the same way. She looked up at Wes. "Every few weeks there was someone," she said. "Always the lonely ones. The ones with no children, or children far away. The ones with some property, and no one around to ask questions when they left this world. They coaxed those people into signing power of attorney while their minds were still clear, or forced them to sign once they were weak, then drained their assets dry. And when there was nothing left to drain, or when that person started asking too many questions, they left this world, always in their sleep, always quickly, always before anyone could come see them." Lena raised a hand to cover her mouth, tears shining in her eyes, because she was thinking of Donna's mother. And sure enough, a few pages later, the old woman stopped her finger on a name and said softly, "Eleanor Pruitt, your friend's mother, isn't she? I remember her. A kind woman." She started asking where her pension money had gone. 3 weeks later, she was gone. Lena began to cry without a sound, and Wes placed one hand on her shoulder, his eyes never leaving the notebook, because he understood that what lay on the table now was no longer a matter of financial fraud, but evidence of a chain of murders stretching across many years, a cold machine that had turned the loneliness of the elderly into profit, and that this was the true reason Mahoney was willing to use all his power to silence one old woman. "How long have you had this?" he asked quietly. "Almost a year," Edith answered. "I was waiting for someone I could trust to give it to. But inside that place, there wasn't anyone like that. Everyone belonged to them, or was too frightened, or too weak." She looked at Wes, then at Lena, and her aged eyes suddenly filled with tears. "So I kept it in my coat, and I waited, and I prayed that before they could take me in my sleep like all the others, I would find the right person." She pushed the notebook across the table toward Wes with both hands, using the same gesture with which she had pushed $3 small across the counter on that first night. "Now I have," she said. Edith's notebook was an indictment, but Otto quickly pointed out its fatal weakness. It was the word of an old woman whom Mahoney had worked hard to build a file proving had memory decline, and in court, that testimony would be broken apart easily if there wasn't something more physical to support it. Medical records, prescriptions, health documents showing that those deaths weren't as natural as people had claimed. It was then that Lena spoke, and what she said made the whole room turn to look at her. "I studied nursing," she said. "I was almost finished before I had to quit because of my father. I can read medical records. I understand prescriptions. I know what a therapeutic dose looks like and what an excessive dose looks like. If they use drugs to speed up those deaths, it'll be in the facility's medication records, and I'm the only person here who can look at those numbers and understand what they're saying." Wes immediately shook his head. "No," he said. "Absolutely not. You're not setting foot in that place." But Lena had already stood, and there was a hardness in the way she held herself that he had never seen before. "This is my friend's mother," she said. "This is Mrs. Lindquist. This is my father. The man I've only just learned the truth about. I've sat still and let other people decide my life for too long. This time I'm going to do something. And they're looking for temporary nursing clerks. I know because Donna once told me Mahoney's facility is always short-staffed and hires through a staffing agency without bothering to check too closely. The plan wasn't nearly as reckless as it sounded, and that was exactly what made it possible. Otto used his connections to get Lena a set of temporary papers through that very staffing agency. And 2 days later, she walked into Mahoney Senior Care not as an intruder, but as a contract employee starting the night shift, wearing blue scrubs and a false name badge, her heart pounding behind a calm face. She did real work for the first 2 hours, passing out medication, taking notes, memorizing the layout of the hallways, and she saw with her own eyes what Edith had described: elderly residents sitting silently in dark rooms, thin and frail, their eyes emptied by sedatives, doors locked from the outside. When the night shift grew heavy and quiet, and only one nurse on duty sat dozing in front of a monitor, Lena slipped toward the records room. She had guessed correctly. The paper files of residents who had died were kept separately in a cabinet at the back, and with her knowledge, she moved through them quickly, and what she saw made her blood turn cold. Prescriptions for sedatives and pain medication at absurdly high doses, for patients who had no matching diagnosis, doses strong enough to slow an elderly, weakened person's heart until it stopped altogether, prescription dates, always falling just before the date of death, and the same doctor's signature appearing again and again. The signature of the very doctor who had left the city. With trembling hands, she used her phone to photograph page after page, name after name matching Edith's notebook. Margaret Ellison, Harold Bishop, Eleanor Pruitt, the physical evidence a court couldn't dismiss. She had just taken the last photo when footsteps sounded in the hallway, and a man's voice asked the nurse on duty where the new temporary worker was, a voice carrying a cold alertness that made Lena's heart seem to drop. She shoved the phone into her pocket, pushed the drawer closed, and stepped out of the records room just as a man in a dark suit turned into the hallway. He looked at her, his eyes lingering too long on her face. "Which section do you work in?" he asked. Lena heard her own voice come out so calm it startled even her. "West Wing?" "I came looking for extra sheets." He did not take his eyes off her. "I haven't seen you before," he said. "I'm new," she answered, her hand already silently feeling for the emergency exit door at the end of the hallway. For a moment that seemed to stretch forever, the two of them stood there, and Lena knew he was weighing whether to stop her, and she knew that if he did, if he searched her pocket and found those photographs, she would never walk out of this building. Then his radio crackled, calling him somewhere else. He gave her one last look, dropped the words, "Get back to your section," and turned away. Lena didn't run. She walked, every step even, through the emergency exit door and into the dark parking lot, where one of Wes's cars was waiting with the engine running softly, and only when the car door closed behind her did she begin to shake uncontrollably, her phone clenched in her hand as if it were the only thing keeping her tied to life. The car had only gone a few blocks from the parking lot of Mahoney Senior Care when a pickup truck accelerated from behind and crowded in close, and Lena understood at once that the man in the hallway hadn't believed her at all, that he had sent someone to follow them. Wes's driver swerved away, but the pickup slammed into the side of the car, sending it spinning halfway around before it plunged into a snowbank along the road. And then everything happened very quickly. Two men jumped down from the pickup, and Lena saw the gleam of metal in their hands. She hadn't known Wes was in the second car following behind until that car door flew open and he stepped out into the falling snow. And what happened next was something Lena would never forget, not because it was brutal in the way she had imagined, but because it was so cold and efficient that it was even more frightening than brutality. Wes didn't shout. He didn't lose control. He moved like water, stripping the first man of his weapon with two clean motions, before dropping him onto the road with one precise strike to the exact place that made the man fold over and go still. And when the second man charged, Wes handled him with the same finality. Not one wasted movement, not one flicker of hesitation. His face calm from beginning to end, in a way that chilled the blood. The face of a man doing a job he had done far too many times. In less than a minute, both men were lying in the snow, and Wes straightened, adjusted the collar of his coat, only his breathing a little heavier than usual, then turned to Lena, and for the first time she saw the real man hidden behind the expensive suit and the soft voice. "Are you all right?" he asked, and his voice was still as gentle as always, and it was that very gentleness set beside what she had just witnessed that made her go cold. She nodded, unable to say a word, and let him help her into the remaining car, but something inside her had changed. All the way back, she sat silent, looking at his hands, the same hands that only minutes earlier had taken down two men without the slightest hesitation, the same hands that had once held Edith's hand as carefully as if he were lifting something that could break, and she couldn't make those two images fit together. And she realized with a dull, aching pain that the man who was slowly taking up a corner of her heart was someone capable of doing things she could never accept. When they reached safety, she kept a distance between them, and Wes noticed it, and he didn't try to close it. because he understood what she had just seen, and he understood that there were parts of him that would always make decent people pull their hands away. But the pain of that night did not end there. They had only just returned to the restaurant when one of Wes's men came running out with a bloodless face, and the news fell like a knife. Edith had vanished. While everyone's attention had been fixed on getting Lena out of Mahoney's facility, someone had known exactly that the upstairs room would be short of guards during that precise stretch of time. Someone had known which path would be unwatched, had known when the shift would change, and had sent people in to take the old woman quietly, cleanly, without a sound. Wes stood frozen in the middle of the restaurant, and Otto came to his side, his face gone gray, because they both understood at the same time what it meant. Only a very small number of people knew that guard schedule, Otto said softly. And that little piece of information about the exact time the watch would be thin tonight, I gave it to only one person. Wes turned, his eyes turning to ice. Royce, he said. At that very moment, the restaurant door opened, and Royce Tillman walked in, brushing snow from his shoulders, and he stopped short when he saw the entire room looking at him, saw Wes's face, and in the single moment before he could put on a normal expression, the truth lay naked in his eyes, the panic of a man who had just realized he'd been exposed. He opened his mouth as if to say something, an explanation, a denial, but Wes was already walking toward him, and this time there was no calm left on his face, only something far more frightening, the cold fury of a man who had just been betrayed by someone he had trusted, a man who had just lost the old woman he had sworn to protect, and for the second time in his life, had broken a promise to Voss blood. Royce collapsed into a chair beneath the weight of Wes's stare, and the truth laid bare, and when Wes asked him where Edith was, his voice was so low that the whole room seemed to hold its breath. Royce confessed everything, that Mahoney had paid him to watch every move Wes made, that he didn't know where they were taking the old woman, but he had heard talk of an old closed-down Mahoney facility in North Providence, a deserted place on the edge of the city. And then he added the sentence that froze the blood in Wes's veins. Mahoney wanted the notebook back, and he wanted to make sure she could never tell anyone anything again, tonight, in her sleep, just like the others. Wes understood at once that he had very little time left, and this was the moment when he stood at a crossroads. On one side was the old man inside him, the one who wanted to storm that place with all his men and level it to the ground. On the other side was what Otto kept reminding him, that if he fought Mahoney with blood, then Mahoney won, because Mahoney had the law shielding him, and Wes did not. And for the first time in his life, Wes chose the path in between. He turned to Otto and gave orders in rapid succession. Call our contact at the federal prosecutor's office. Wake him up if you have to, because Edith's notebook and Lena's photographs of the medication files are no longer just a state matter. Mahoney's facilities spread across several New England states, and he's been collecting life insurance payouts from the victims. That's insurance fraud and murder across state lines. That's FBI jurisdiction. That's the kind of thing even Senator Walsh can't smother. While Otto made the call, Wes did the one thing only a man in his position could do. He activated his underground network, not to spill blood, but to locate. Eyes scattered across the harbors, warehouses, and roads, and within 40 minutes, he had confirmed unusual activity at the very abandoned facility in North Providence that Royce had mentioned. Lights burning inside a building that should have been completely dark, 2 cars parked outside, one of them, the black SUV Lena had seen on the first night. Wes went with his men, but he did not go alone in the old sense, because on the way there, an unmarked car quietly joined the convoy. Federal agents called by Otto's contact, people who had spent years waiting for something solid enough to touch Mahoney's empire, and now they finally had it in their hands. They arrived just in time. Inside that cold, decaying building, Edith had been loosely tied to an old hospital bed, and a person in a white coat was preparing a syringe, while Mahoney stood there, still in his perfect suit, still composed, searching through the pockets of her coat, for the notebook he did not know was no longer in her possession. When the door burst open, everything shattered at once. Wes's men poured in and subdued Mahoney's people, and Wes walked straight toward Mahoney, and for one moment, all he wanted was to close both hands around that man's throat, but he didn't. He stopped one step away from Mahoney, breathed out, and let his hands fall to his sides, because Lena was standing there in the doorway, because Edith was watching him, and because he understood that killing Mahoney would only make him into the thing Mahoney had always been. "It's over," Wes said, his voice trembling with the fury he was holding back. Not my way, the way that'll make you live a very long time remembering it. And at that moment, the federal agents rushed in with badges and warrants, and Mahoney's face cracked for the first time into true terror when he understood that this was not an underworld reckoning he could bribe or slip around, but federal law, something beyond Walsh's reach. And then came the final turn, because in the middle of that chaos, Inspector Miller, the man who had followed Mahoney there to supervise the night's work, looked around, saw the federal badges, saw the ship sinking, and immediately did what men like him always do. He turned to the agents and began talking. "I've been watching this man for months. I can give you everything on Walsh, the money trail, all of it. Trying to save himself by selling out the very man he had been serving." Mahoney spun around and glared at him. And for the first time in the entire story, that smooth face twisted with a real emotion. Betrayal. The very thing he himself had sown for so long. Royce had already been handed over by Wes's men to the authorities, along with his full confession. The fate of a traitor to both sides. And in the middle of all of it, Wes crossed the room, knelt beside the bed, and with the same hands Lena had just seen bring two men down, he gently untied the ropes from the old woman's wrists. When the last rope slipped away from her wrist, Edith stirred faintly, her eyelids trembling open, and her clouded eyes needed a moment to find their focus again, passing over Wes's face without recognizing him right away, then moving around the cold room filled with shadowed figures and flashing lights, until they stopped at the doorway, where Lena stood. And the old woman, so weak she could barely form the word, breathed only one name: Lena. Lena rushed across the room, dropped to her knees beside the bed, and gathered that small, fragile old woman into her arms with such care, as if she were afraid Edith might break, and Edith trembled as she clasped Lena's hand, those familiar icy fingers curling around hers, and whispered, "I knew you'd come, child. I knew it." And Lena sobbed into her silver hair, the tears of nearly a year of exhaustion, fear, and loneliness finally breaking loose all at once. "They meant to put me to sleep," Edith whispered, like the others. "But I wasn't afraid. I'd already given the notebook away. I'd done what I had to do." "Hush," Lena said softly. "Don't talk anymore. You're safe now. It's over." Behind them, the federal agents were handcuffing Mahoney, and there was nothing calm left in him now. Only a middle-aged man in an expensive suit being led out into the snow, still babbling about lawyers, about phone calls he would make, about the people he knew, but this time no one was listening, because the names he had once used to frighten people were sinking with him now. One agent carefully placed Edith's worn, cloth-covered notebook into an evidence bag and sealed it. And in that small gesture, there was a weight the whole room could feel, because the dozens of names inside that notebook, Margaret Ellison, Harold Bishop, Eleanor Pruitt, and so many others who had left this world in silence with no one knowing the truth, would finally be given a voice. Another agent told Otto that with the notebook, with Lena's photographs of the medication files, and with Miller's testimony, not only Mahoney but the entire network behind him would come down, and that Senator Walsh would wake up in the morning to find himself the subject of a federal investigation that no connection could save him from. Wes stepped back, letting that moment belong to Lena and Edith, and he looked at the girl holding the old woman, the girl who carried the blood of the man who had died so Wes could live, and something inside his chest, something that had been hardened over for more than 20 years, finally cracked open. He walked to the broken window frame and looked out into the white, snowy night, and in his mind, silently, without a sound, he spoke to a man who had been gone for 13 years. "I'm sorry, Felix," he thought. "I made you wait too long. I didn't find your girl when I should have. But she's safe now, and I swear to you, this time I won't take my eyes off her again. You took that bullet for me, and for 13 years I didn't know what to do with that debt, but now I do." He closed his eyes for a brief moment, and when he opened them, something on his face had come undone, a weight set down after years of carrying it. Behind him, Lena looked up, her face soaked with tears, but her eyes found him across the room, and in that look there was no longer the fear of the night before, when she had seen him bring down two men, but something more complicated, something gentler, the first fragile understanding that this man, with all the darkness inside him, had chosen not to become the thing he might have been. Edith gently tightened her hand around Lena's and whispered, "Take me home, child." And for the first time in many years, that word, home, carried a true meaning, for all three people fate had tied together on a snowy night with a bowl of soup that cost $3.14. It took several days after Edith had recovered and been taken to rest safely in a warm apartment Wes had arranged, before he finally came to Lena to say what he had delayed for far too long. And he chose to say it on a late afternoon in the closed restaurant, with only the two of them among the empty tables and the pale golden winter sunlight filtering through the window. He told her everything, hiding nothing, softening nothing. He told her about her father, about Felix Voss, the man who had guided him when Wes was still a young man who didn't know what fear was, the man with the loud laugh and the belief that even in darkness, a person could still keep something decent inside. He told her about the night at the harbor, about the trap, about how Felix had thrown himself into the path of the bullet meant for him without 1 second of hesitation. He told her about the oath he had spoken beside the hospital bed, that he would find and protect Felix's wife and child, and about how he had failed, about the months of hopeless searching for a woman who had been determined to disappear, and about how he had let that promise sink beneath the years. Lena sat listening, her face moving through one emotion after another, and when he finished speaking, she was silent for a very long time. And when she finally spoke, her voice trembled with a pain she hadn't even had time to name. "So, my father was one of your men," she said. "My whole life, my mother told me he worked at the harbor, that he was a good man, that he died because he was sick. She lied to me. He lied to me." Wes did not defend anyone. "Your mother lied to protect you," he said softly, "so you could grow up without carrying the darkness that killed your father. And your father was a good man, Lena. Much better than I am. The work doesn't define all of a person, and he proved that in the final moment of his life." Lena began to cry, not because she was angry at him, but because her whole life she had not known who she was, had carried a debt without understanding why it felt so heavy, had been orphaned from a father she had never truly known. "I carried trays under your roof for 11 months, she said through her tears. "You didn't even know I existed." "I know," Wes replied, and for the first time she heard naked pain in his voice. "That is something I'll have to live with for the rest of my life. I'm not asking you to forgive me, because I don't deserve forgiveness. I'm only asking you to give me the chance to keep the promise I should have kept 13 years ago." And the way he chose to keep that promise was what slowly made Lena begin to open her heart. He didn't press a stack of money into her hand to erase the debt and consider the matter finished, because he had learned, from Lena herself, that pride was something that couldn't be bought and shouldn't be bought. Instead, with Edith's notebook and the evidence that had brought Mahoney into the light, Wes did something no one expected from a man like him. He used his resources and his clean connections to create a real foundation, an organization to protect lonely, elderly people with nowhere to turn, named for the dead in Edith's notebook, a place that stood in complete opposition to the false charity Mahoney had once built, a place where human dignity wasn't put up for sale. He invited Edith to serve as an advisor, and the old woman, with the sharp memory she had once been forced to pretend she had lost in order to survive, became a voice for those who no longer had one. And for Lena, he didn't give her money. He gave back to her the thing life had taken away. He arranged for her father's debt to be resolved legally and transparently, not as charity, but as a correction of a wrong. And then he asked whether she wanted to return to nursing school to finish what she had been forced to leave unfinished, not because he was paying for it, but because the new foundation needed exactly people like her, people who understood the suffering of the weak from the inside. Lena looked at him for a long time, and in her eyes, the hurt finally began to give way to something else, not complete forgiveness, that would take time, but the beginning of it. The following winter came to Providence again, and snow once more fell softly outside the windows of Genova's, but inside the warm restaurant, everything was different now. Lena stood at the counter, no longer in the black uniform of an exhausted waitress, but with the name badge of a shift manager, her shoulders straighter, her eyes more at peace, because almost a year had passed since the night a starving old woman changed her life with a question. She was closing the day's books when the heavy oak door opened, and a rush of cold air swept in with the slow steps of an elderly homeless man, his coat torn, his beard dusted with snow, his lowered eyes full of the hesitation of someone who had grown far too used to being turned away. He stopped at the threshold, and before he could awkwardly search his pockets to see how much he had left, before he could ask the question Lena knew all too well, she had already stepped out from behind the counter, and instead of asking how much money he had, she only smiled and pulled out a chair. "Please sit down," she said gently. "It's terribly cold out there." Let me bring you a bowl of hot soup. There's always a place for you here." The old man looked up, astonished as if he couldn't believe what he had heard. And in that moment, something broke open quietly on his weathered face, the rare feeling of a human being suddenly being seen as a human being. Wes stood leaning against the kitchen doorway, watching it all, not interfering, only quietly looking at the woman he had fallen in love with before he even knew it, watching her do the very thing her father had believed could still exist even in the darkest places 13 years ago. Kindness. They had traveled a long road to reach this place. He and she, through hurt, through suspicion, through all the shadows of his past that she had had to learn to understand rather than simply close her eyes to. And the feeling that had grown between them wasn't the kind of hurried romance that burns bright and vanishes. It was something tempered by trial, mature, real, two imperfect people, choosing to lean on each other and choosing the light together. At the familiar table in the corner, Edith sat with a hot cup of tea, healthy and clear-minded, her eyes sparkling as she watched the old man being invited to sit. And when Lena carried the bowl of soup out, the old woman braced herself on her cane, rose, walked to the counter, and with fingers that no longer trembled from hunger, she placed 3 small coins on its surface. $3.14, the exact amount that had started everything. "Not to pay for this bowl of soup," she said softly, her eyes warm, "but to save for the next person who walks through that door." And that is exactly what this story wants to leave behind. That the worth of a human being is never measured by the amount of money they have in their hand. That the way we treat the weakest among us, the lonely, elderly, the poor, the ones who have nothing left to give back, is the true measure of each person's character and of an entire society. Sometimes only one small act of kindness, a bowl of soup, a chair pulled out, a look without judgment, can save a life. And sometimes it can save the very person who offers that kindness too. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share this video with the people you love, so every day we can listen together to more meaningful stories that move the heart. How do you feel about tonight's story? And what does it remind you of in your own real life? Have you ever given or received unexpected kindness in the hardest moment of your life? Please leave a comment and share what you feel from deep in your heart, because we always hope to hear your sincere stories and thoughts. Thank you for taking the time to listen until the very last moment. May everyone watching this video always have truly good health, a joyful life, peace, and love filling every day. Goodbye for now, take care, and I'll see you again in the next video.